Let's see. Is this going to work? Okay, hang on. There we go. Alright. Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Uncivil American Podcast. I am your host, Clayton, and tonight we're going to be talking about Fort Sumter and today's modern equivalent, which I and many others believe is the Charlie Kirk assassination. We'll also be going over some of the terror attacks against ICE, which obviously are going to be a bit related to it. So, starting back in 1860, President Lincoln was elected as the first Republican after the formation of the Republican Party, which was generally created as on an abolitionist platform by various members of the founding members of the party. Not all the Republicans were into the abolition of slavery, and Lincoln himself was not a staunch abolitionist per se, although he did want to stop the spread of slavery. Now, regardless of whether or not Lincoln actually wanted to abolish slavery or just limit the expansion of slavery into the Western territories, the South still felt that it was an extreme threat to their way of life and, of course, their economy, which was, still slavery and indentured servitude, of which a lot of the slaves were actually indentured servants, which is still not good, and I, of course, don't agree with that. That's just the way that it was back then. We had blacks that were slaves, you had blacks that were slave owners. You had whites that were slaves, and you had whites that were slave owners, because don't forget, the Irish came over and a lot of them were forced into indentured servitude and slavery as well. That's just the way it worked back then. And it wasn't just one race that was controlling the other race or an entire other race. It's going to hurt some people's feelings, but blacks were honestly just as responsible for enslaving other blacks as whites were. There was the Dahomey tribe up in northwest Africa that was going around and attacking other tribes in the areas. They captured them, bring them back, sell them as slaves. A lot of them they were also keeping as their own slaves, and any slaves that they captured and they did not sell and did not feel that they did not want to keep, they unalived them. That was pretty much just how things went there. Okay. Fast forward to the 1850s, late 1850s to 1860, and you had abolitionist members of Congress and the Senate that were, lack of a better term, they were just tired of the slave trade. They thought it was abhorrent. And without being able to really make any progress in the Democrat Party, coupled with the dissolution of the Whig Party in the early 1850s, they felt there was little recourse but to branch off and create a party of their own, which became the Republican Party. The newly created Republican Party, of course, elected Abraham Lincoln as their first candidate to run for the presidential election, and of course he won the general election, but before Lincoln could even take office, due to the southern states' beliefs about his stance on slavery, several of the southern states seceded from the Union, and they lost my train of thought on that one. But anyway, moving on. Now, only about 5% of the South actually owned slaves, if that, because they were not a cheap commodity to purchase and maintain in the South. And it was mostly the plantation owners. A few months after those southern states seceded, Lincoln made a call to arms for volunteers to go into the South to quell the rebellion after the siege of Fort Sumter. After this call to arms from President Lincoln is when you had the rest of the southern states secede to join the Confederacy, and with the, they seceded with the other southern states because they felt that President Lincoln had overstepped his bounds, overstepped his authority by calling for the volunteers to invade the South. They thought that this was unconstitutional, as at this point in time, secession was not an illegal thing to do, and they thought that it was their right and their duty to throw off their government when they felt that it was being detrimental to their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. In 1859, prior to Lincoln's election to the presidency, you had the John Brown raid on Harper's Ferry, which was dealt with when Robert E. Lee and a detachment of Marines were sent to Harper's Ferry to capture John Brown, who was then tried and hung for several crimes, including attempting to instigate a slave rebellion. After this is when you had a lot of Southerners that really started to get the feeling that, hey, these people are really trying to kill us. For lack of a better term, that's how they felt. These people are trying to destroy our way of life. They have no respect for our rights. They have no respect for our economy. Because on top of the whole John Brown raid and the stance of the majority of the Republican Party and Lincoln to a certain extent, you also had tariffs, like tariff of abomination, what some people have called it, which were tariffs on southern goods that were upwards of 75% when they were going to the north. So naturally, you had serious economic concerns regarding not just the tariffs, but also the primary way that the southern economy was ran. Where the plantations obviously used indentured servitude and slave labor to maintain the plantations and the crops and the cotton that were sent north and overseas. So at this point, it was, for lack of a better term, an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object, at which point there was really only one outcome that was going to come of it, and that was going to be chaos and the catastrophe of war. Now, at this point, the yeah, General PGT Beauregard, for those of you who don't know his name, is Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, who is the commanding officer of the Confederate forces at Fort Sumter. There was a small detachment, or well, small garrison at Fort Sumter, who the Confederates demanded their surrender of the fort, and they refused. And at approximately 0430 on April 12, 1861, the Confederate forces under the command of General Beauregard opened fire on Fort Sumter, causing severe damage to the fort itself. And after they nearly destroyed the fort, the garrison did finally surrender. And it was at this point that Lincoln made the call for the volunteers to go down to the southern states to squash the rebellion. And like I said, after Lincoln made the call for volunteers, that's when the rest of the southern states seceded, including Virginia. And President Lincoln is famously known to have asked Robert E. Lee if he would be willing to command the federal forces that were being raised. And as General Lee famously said, "I go where Virginia goes." And of course, when Virginia seceded and joined the Confederacy, Lee made the decision to withdraw from the Federal Army. The day after, I believe he was granted command of all the forces of the Virginia militia that had been called up. And a few days after that is when the state of Virginia officially entered into the Confederacy, and the forces of Virginia were initially placed under the command of General Joseph Johnston. The rest is history on that. Now, moving forward, because there was a lot of stuff going on with the backdrop of the Civil War, leading up to the Civil War, within the 10 years prior, you had situations like the Bleeding Kansas, where you had a lot of Union forces and abolitionist forces that were facing off against what would end up being Confederate and Confederate guerrilla forces. They were conducting raids, attacks, basically they're causing atrocities on both sides of those battles and fights during the 10 years prior. Now, moving forward towards to today, and how modern America is rhyming with 1860 and 1850s America. Over the last 15 years, we've seen a pretty steady uptick in violence, and generally just pretty bad rhetoric, mostly coming from the left. Obviously, and starting in 2016, you had President Trump. 2015 he declared his candidacy for president. 2016, The left started in with, Trump is a Nazi, Trump is literally Hitler, Trump is worse than Hitler, conservatives are Nazis, on and on and on. And fast forward, because there's a lot that we can cover in the last 10 years, but fast forwarding to July of 2024, and you have a leftist that takes a shot at President Trump by, grace of God, he turned his head right there at the last, millisecond, and the bullet ended up just catching him in the ear. Obviously the leftists were spewing all their crap, trying to say that it was a hoax and that he had a ketchup packet and all this other absolute BS. Yeah, no. He was shot in the ear. It's clear as day. There's video of it. Like, there's no way around it. Obviously, the assassin, Thomas Crooks, was taken out by one of the Secret Service counter sniper teams. Fast forwarding a few more months after that, and you have another individual who attempted to assassinate President Trump. He built himself a little sniper's nest, and luckily he was just not very good at what he did or what he was doing, and stuck his barrel through the chain link fence, at which point a Secret Service agent happened to see the rifle barrel sticking out from, through the fence, and opened fire on him. Lucky for him, the Secret Service agent also missed, but he was taken into custody, and he was recently convicted of the attempted assassination. So, I mean, the left have continued to spew the rhetoric, inspiring waves of terror attacks on Tesla owners, Tesla vehicles, Tesla dealerships, ICE agents, ICE facilities, plenty of other incidents that, started out at the beginning of this year. And obviously culminating thus far, leading to the assassination of Charlie Kirk, which I and many others believe was the Fort Sumter of our time. If it hadn't been for the left's reaction to the assassination, I don't think the overturn window would have shifted nearly as hard as it has, and I don't think we would have really felt like it was Fort Sumter. But considering how the left have not only failed to condemn it, but they've actually celebrated it on numerous occasions and continued to push the same rhetoric and hate even further, so, you gotta ask yourself, where does this go? I mean, it's the simple, unstoppable force versus an immovable object. Make no mistake, we are in the middle of a communist revolution. Okay. There have been leftist terror attacks, going on several times a week against ICE and DHS personnel over the last several months, including one several weeks ago where an individual attempted to ram DHS officers at the Chicago airport. Several weeks before that, we had another leftist that was up on a rooftop attempting to snipe ICE transport officers at the facility that they were at. Last week, the head for the Latin Kings in Chicago supposedly gave a green light for members of the gang to shoot